The porch light was already on when I pulled into the driveway. A small thing. Ordinary if you lived here, but I'd been traveling for 11 hours, 2 flights, a rental car, 90 minutes on a state highway I hadn't driven in 2 years, and I hadn't come for a visit. I'd come because my younger sister lived 20 minutes from our father and apparently couldn't manage his medication schedule. That was the version I'd built on the plane. I had my questions ready. I had the pharmacy's voicemail saved on my phone. The porch steps were swept. The railing was solid. And when I opened the front door, my father was sitting in his chair, dressed and shaved, watching the same local news channel he'd watched my entire childhood. I set my bag down in a house that didn't need rescuing and felt, for the first time, that maybe I was the one who was late. His name is Harold. He's 76. He has good days and foggy days, and the difference between the two has widened steadily over the past 2 years. The way a crack in a foundation widens, slow enough to ignore if you're not standing next to it. I hadn't been standing next to it. That first evening, I walked through the house while Dad dozed in his chair. I told myself I was getting reoriented. What I was doing was looking for evidence. The kitchen was clean. Not aggressively clean, not the kind of scrubbing someone does the night before an inspection. The sponge by the sink was dry from use, not new. The counters had the faint mineral haze of hard water wiped away routinely. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet from a hardware store I didn't recognize, was a medication chart. Printed columns, handwritten check marks. 7 weeks of them. My sister Joy's handwriting. Tight, careful, the same print she'd used on school projects 30 years ago. I opened the fridge. Stacked containers, each one labeled in the same handwriting. Tuesday's soup. Thursday's casserole. Saturday's chicken and rice. Dates, contents, reheating instructions. A rotation that had nothing to do with my arrival. In the hallway between the living room and the bathroom, someone had installed a grab bar. It was anchored properly, not the kind of thing you slap up in an afternoon. The wall around it had been touched up with matching paint. I stood there with my hand on the bar and tried to remember the last time I'd asked Joy whether Dad needed anything like this. I couldn't, because I hadn't asked. I'd asked whether he was okay. Those are different questions. I went to bed that night in my old room, the one Joy hadn't touched, hadn't converted, hadn't changed, and I lay there trying to reassemble the version of this trip that made sense to me. Joy had obviously cleaned before I came. The chart could have been filled in after the fact. People stage things for visitors. I knew that. I worked in operations. I understood systems, and I understood when someone was managing appearances. That was the explanation I needed. So I kept it. 6 months earlier, on a Sunday night in March, I'd called Dad the way I always did. My Sunday calls lasted about 12 minutes. I know that because I'd glance at the time when I dialed and again when I hung up, the way you check the clock during a meeting you've attended too many times. I never thought about what that said about me. I just thought I was efficient. Dad sounded fine that night. He told me about a show he'd watched. He asked about the weather where I lived, the way he always did, as if my city were a foreign country he'd never visited. I told him it was cold. He said it was cold there too. We traded weather the way people trade small bills, low value, easy to count, no one gets shortchanged. At some point, he mentioned Joy. She came by today, like always. Fixed that gutter thing, I noted it. Filed it, the basics. I didn't ask what the gutter thing was. I didn't ask how Joy was. I asked if he'd taken his pills, and he said yes, and I said good. And we hung up at the 11-minute mark. Then I opened my laptop, sent the monthly transfer, $800, direct deposit to his account, and went back to the project I was working on. And I felt, in that specific, measurable way I always felt after a Sunday call, that I had done my part, $800 a month. 52 phone calls a year, a visit every 14 months or so. I had it quantified. I had it scheduled. I could point to it and say, this is what I contribute. It was clean. It was verifiable. What I didn't have a number for was the question I never asked. What does it cost Joy to be the one who's actually there? I never asked because the answer might have required me to do something about it. And I had already built a life that was very efficient at making sure nothing required me to be anywhere I didn't choose to be. Joy arrived on Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I heard her car in the driveway before I heard the door. She came in carrying 2 canvas grocery bags, not new ones, not the stiff kind you buy and forget in the trunk. These were soft and faded, and she held them the way you hold something you've carried 1,000 times, balanced on one hip while she opened the screen door with her free hand. She saw me standing in the kitchen and said, "Hey." Not surprised. Not warm, just acknowledging that I was in a room she knew better than I did. She went straight to the fridge. Started unpacking. She didn't ask if Dad had eaten breakfast. She checked the kitchen in a way that told her. She looked at the dish in the drying rack, glanced at the medication chart, opened a container in the fridge to see what was left. It took her about 45 seconds to assess the state of the household, and she did it the way a pilot reads instruments, not studying them, just confirming what she expected. I said, "Can I help with anything?" She said, "The cans go on the second shelf. Labels facing out. He finds them faster that way. I put the cans on the second shelf. Labels facing out." And I realized I didn't know that. I'd grown up in this house, I'd eaten from this pantry for 18 years, and I didn't know my father found cans faster with the labels facing out because I hadn't been here to learn it. Joy checked Dad's medications. She talked to him, not a check-in, not a status report. She asked about the news. She mentioned a neighbor's dog that had gotten loose again. He laughed. It was the laugh of someone who's heard this story before, the way you laugh at a running joke with someone you see 3 times a week. That afternoon, I saw Mrs. Kessler across the street. She waved. I walked over because I felt I should. "How long are you staying?" she asked. Friendly, casual, but the question had a shape to it. "You're visiting." Joy didn't visit. Joy was part of the infrastructure. Back inside, I found the notebook. It was by the phone, a spiral-bound notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $2. 14 months of entries. Joy's handwriting, dated medication adjustments, doctor appointments, pharmacy hours and which pharmacist knew Dad's history, daily notes, some brief, some detailed. Good day. Remembered to eat lunch on his own. Foggy morning. Took him 20 minutes to find his glasses. Moved them to the hook by the door. And then, on a page near the middle, in the same careful print, he likes the blue mug. Don't move the remote from the side table. He gets confused if the pantry is rearranged. I closed the notebook. I was holding 14 months of my sister's attention in my hands. 14 months of her noticing things I would never have thought to notice. Not because I'm stupid, but because noticing requires presence. Sustained, repetitive, unglamorous presence. The kind you can't schedule into 12-minute calls. The pharmacy voicemail, the one I'd saved on my phone, the one I'd flown 1,100 miles to confront. I understood it now. Joy picks up medications on Tuesdays. The pharmacy's automated system called on a Monday because the prescription window had opened. By Tuesday morning, Joy had it handled. The voicemail was a 24-hour gap between a system's clock and a person's schedule. I had built an entire intervention on a timing discrepancy. 3 weeks before my trip, on a Sunday night, I'd been on the phone with Dad when I heard it. In the background, tinny and mechanical, the pharmacy's automated callback. A prescription hadn't been picked up. Dad didn't react to it. He probably didn't even register it. The phone was across the room, and his hearing had thinned in the past year, another thing I knew abstractly but hadn't adjusted for. I heard it clearly, and it landed in my chest like confirmation. I didn't mention it to him. I waited until we hung up and called Joy. She didn't answer. It was Sunday night. Her day off, if she had those anymore. She was probably in her apartment, eating something she hadn't had to cook for someone else, watching something she hadn't had to choose with someone else in mind. She didn't pick up, and I let that silence mean something it didn't. I left a voicemail. I can hear it now, the tone I used. Measured, careful, The kind of voice you use when you want to sound concerned, but you're actually building a case. Hi, Joy, just checking in. Wanted to make sure Dad's prescriptions are being handled. Let me know. Being handled. As if she were a contractor I was following up with. As if the medication schedule were a deliverable she'd missed. She called back the next morning. Brief, flat, I'll pick it up tomorrow. Tomorrow was Tuesday, her day. She'd pick it up the way she always picked it up, on the schedule she'd maintained for over a year. There was nothing unusual about her response except its brevity, and I heard that brevity as evasion. I booked the flight that evening. I packed a bag and a notebook, an actual notebook, the kind I use for work, with tabs. I had questions written out. I had the voicemail saved as evidence. I told a coworker I was flying home because my sister was overwhelmed. That was the word I used, overwhelmed, not neglectful. I wasn't that harsh, even with myself. But overwhelmed implied incapable, and incapable justified my arrival. I was flying home to audit my sister the way I audited vendor accounts. And I hadn't asked myself the question that might have stopped me. If Joy is overwhelmed, why haven't I offered to carry anything? On Wednesday, day 3 of my visit, I reorganized the pantry. I wish I could say I did it thoughtfully. I didn't. I did it the way I do everything. I saw a system that didn't meet my standards, and I improved it. I pulled everything off the shelves, sorted by category, aligned the labels, grouped by frequency of use based on what I'd seen Dad reach for. It took me 40 minutes. It looked excellent when I was done. Dad came into the kitchen, opened the pantry door, and stood there. He didn't reach for anything. He looked at the shelves the way you look at a room you don't recognize. He closed the door, opened it again, and then he said quietly, "Where are the crackers?" They were on the top shelf. I'd put them there because they were a snack item, and snack items go on the top shelf in a properly organized pantry. Joy had them on the second shelf, left side, because Dad could reach the second shelf without stretching, and the left side was where his hand went first, and she knew that because she'd watched him reach for crackers 500 times. I had organized the pantry for efficiency. Joy had organized it for him. Dad asked if Joy was coming tomorrow. Not because he was confused, because he wanted the person who knew where things went. I put the crackers back on the second shelf. But I didn't know where the rest of it went. I'd dismantled a system I hadn't built, and I couldn't rebuild it because I didn't know what I'd taken apart. And then I found the receipt for the grab bars. It had slipped behind the junk drawer, dated 9 months ago, a hardware store 20 minutes from the house. Joy had driven there, bought the bars, driven back, measured, drilled, anchored, and painted. While I was 800 miles away sending money and making Sunday calls, 9 months. She'd been modifying this house for 9 months, and I never noticed because I never asked what the house looked like. This is the part I didn't know until Joy told me, days later, in the kitchen. But I need to tell it now because it changes the meaning of everything I've described. A year before this visit, I came home. A short trip, a long weekend, maybe 48 hours. I don't remember exactly, and I think the fact that I don't remember the length of my own visit tells you something I couldn't have told you at the time. During that visit, I reorganized the kitchen. The same instinct, the same approach. I moved the plates to a more logical cabinet. I rearranged the spice rack. I cleaned out the junk drawer. I left feeling like I'd accomplished something tangible, something I could measure the way I measured everything. I was here. I improved things. I contributed. I flew home. And on Tuesday, Joy came by for her regular visit and she put everything back. She didn't call me. She didn't tell me. She just moved the plates to where Dad expected them, put the spices back in the order he recognized, and refilled the junk drawer with the things he rummaged through every morning looking for a pen that worked. She did this. I now realize because she understood something I didn't, that for Dad, predictability wasn't a luxury. It was the scaffolding that let him function. Moving his things didn't help him. It disoriented him. And my need to fix was more about me than about him. Joy had been undoing my improvements for at least a year, quietly, without complaint. Without even mentioning it, because mentioning it would have required a conversation she didn't have the energy for, with a sister who would have heard it as criticism and responded with a spreadsheet. And here I was, standing in a pantry I'd just reorganized again, watching my father search for crackers on the wrong shelf, repeating a pattern I didn't know I had. Joy arrived on Thursday at 10, same as Tuesday. Grocery bags on her hip, keys on the hook by the door. She walked into the kitchen and I saw the moment she noticed the pantry, not because she reacted, but because she didn't. Her eyes moved to the cabinets, registered the change, and then she set the bags down and started putting things back. I watched her hands. They knew exactly where everything went. The cans on the second shelf, labels out. The crackers on the left. The cereal above the stove where Dad could see it when he decided what he wanted for breakfast. She didn't consult the notebook. She didn't hesitate. She had this house in her muscle memory. She put everything back in under 10 minutes, and she didn't say a word about it. Not a sigh, not a pointed comment, not even a glance in my direction. She just did it the way you reset a clock after a power outage. Automatic, necessary, unremarkable. Then she checked on Dad. She asked about his morning. She refilled his water glass without him asking, because she knew he wouldn't ask, because he forgot he was thirsty most days. I sat at the kitchen table and felt something I hadn't felt on this trip yet. Not guilt. Guilt is too clean, too self-contained. Guilt says I did something wrong and then lets you atone. What I felt was closer to irrelevance. I had flown 1,100 miles to fix a problem that didn't exist. And in doing so, I had created the only problem this house actually had. That evening, after Dad went to bed, Joy and I sat at the kitchen table. She'd made tea. She didn't ask what kind I wanted. She made 2 cups of the same tea Dad kept in the cabinet, because it was what was there. She knew where the kettle was, which burner heated fastest, where the mugs were. I didn't know any of those things, and the gap between what she knew about this household and what I knew felt, for the first time, like the actual distance between us. Not 900 miles. Something much wider than that. I said, "Joy, why didn't you tell me it was this much?" She looked at her tea. She didn't look angry. She looked like someone deciding whether this conversation was worth the energy it would cost. "I did, Elaine," she said. "Every phone call. You heard what you needed to hear. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say you never told me you had a notebook. You never mentioned the grab bars. You never said you cut your hours. But the notebook was by the phone. The grab bars were in the hallway. The evidence had been in this house the entire time. I just hadn't been in this house. I dropped to part-time," she said, 18 months ago, right around when Dad started having the foggy mornings. 18 months. I'd been sending $800 a month for 18 months, and I'd never asked why Joy suddenly had more availability. I'd noticed, distantly, that she seemed to be at Dad's house more often. I'd filed it under she has more free time. I hadn't considered that she'd made more free time by cutting her income in half. "The money helped," she said. She said it evenly, without bitterness, and I understood she was being fair. She was acknowledging my contribution before she told me what I hadn't contributed. "I never said it didn't," she paused. "But you never asked what it cost me to be here." The kitchen was quiet. I heard the clock on the wall, the same clock that had been there since I was 12. I heard the refrigerator cycling, keeping Joy's labeled containers cold, maintaining the system she'd built to keep our father fed and safe and oriented in his own home. I didn't have an answer. Not because I couldn't think of one, but because every answer I could think of was a defense, and she hadn't attacked me. She'd stated a fact. I never asked. That was true. I could not make it untrue by explaining why. She left around 9. I sat at the table for a long time after that. I replayed the phone calls. Not all of them. I don't remember all of them, which is its own kind of evidence. But the ones I could recall I heard differently now. "We're managing." I'd heard dismissal. What she'd actually said was, "I'm managing." She'd dropped the I because it would have sounded like a plea, and she'd stopped pleading around the same time she'd stopped explaining. "He's fine." I'd heard a status report. What she'd actually said was, "I'm making sure he's fine, 3 days a week, every week. And I've stopped telling you about it because you receive the information and change nothing." "It's handled." I'd heard evasion. What she'd actually said was, "I've handled it. And I've stopped asking you to notice, because noticing would obligate you. And we both know you've arranged your life so that nothing obligates you." I sat with that. It wasn't comfortable. I thought about the money. The $800 was real. It paid for groceries, pharmacy copays, the water bill, a portion of the home insurance. It wasn't nothing. I hadn't been doing nothing, but I had been using it. Not just as help and as proof. Proof I was involved. Proof I cared. Proof that my absence was a practical limitation and not a choice. Every month I sent the transfer and felt the ledger balance. I'm contributing. And because the contribution was measurable, I never had to measure what I wasn't doing. I wasn't driving 20 minutes 3 times a week. I wasn't learning which mug Dad preferred. I wasn't watching his morning confusion and adjusting the house to meet it. I wasn't installing grab bars or labeling containers or writing in a notebook that no one would ever thank me for keeping. I wasn't there. And I had arranged my entire life, my job, my apartment, my schedule, my Sunday calls, my efficient 12-minute conversations, so that there was never structurally required of me. The distance wasn't something that happened to me. It was something I built, and judgment was the wall I maintained around it. If joy was failing, then my absence was vigilance. If she was neglecting Dad, then my distance was justified concern. I needed her to be doing a bad job because if she was doing a good job, then I was the one who hadn't shown up. She was doing a good job. She'd been doing a good job for 18 months, and I flew 1,100 miles to prove otherwise because the alternative was admitting I'd been wrong the entire time. I could go home tomorrow. Send the flight confirmation from the gate. Resume the $800 transfers and the Sunday calls. Nothing would change. Joy would keep coming 3 days a week. Dad would keep being fed and medicated and dressed and visited. The system would work because Joy made it work. And I would keep funding it from a comfortable distance and telling myself the funding was enough. Or I could do something I hadn't done once during this entire trip. During the past 18 months, maybe during the past several years, I could ask Joy what she actually needed. Friday morning. Joy came early. She'd adjusted her schedule because of my visit, which meant she'd adjusted her life again for someone who hadn't noticed the first adjustment. I said, "Can you walk me through the medication schedule?" She looked at me. Not suspiciously, but carefully. She was trying to determine whether this was another audit. "Not to check on it," I said. "I want to take over the pharmacy coordination. The calls, the refills, the insurance follow-ups. I can do that from home. It's what I'm good at. A small offer. Logistical, not emotional. It was honestly the only kind of offer I knew how to make. But it was also the first time I'd asked how to help instead of deciding what help should look like. She showed me. She walked through the medications, the dosages, the refill timing, the pharmacy's automated system, which prescriptions required prior authorization, which doctor to call for which renewal. She was organized, more organized than I'd expected, and then I caught myself being surprised and felt the shame of it. Of course she was organized. She'd been running this for 18 months. She was better at this than I was. I wrote everything down. In my work notebook, the one with the tabs I'd brought to audit her, I used it the way it should have been used from the beginning, to learn. We spent Saturday at the kitchen table with a notepad between us. Columns, tasks, timelines. Who handles what? When, how information flows between us. It wasn't emotional. We didn't hug. We didn't have the conversation where I apologize and she forgives me and we cry and everything is restored. That conversation exists in a version of this story that's simpler than ours. What we did was divide labor. Pharmacy coordination, mine. Insurance paperwork, mine. Sunday calls extended to 30 minutes with actual questions, written down beforehand if I couldn't trust myself to ask them naturally. Dad's daily preferences and routines. Joy would update a shared document. I would read it. I would learn which shelf the crackers go on. Joy said. We can try this and see. Not thank you. Not I forgive you. Not I'm so glad you finally understand. Just we can try this and see? A conditional acceptance, a probationary arrangement between two people who were not yet and might never be, fully honest with each other about the years that had already passed. She showed me which shelf the cereal goes on, above the stove, where Dad can see it when he's deciding. I put the cereal there. It stayed. I watched her during the Saturday routine. Not auditing, learning. She checked his blood pressure, organized his pill case for the week, wiped down the kitchen, took out the trash, asked him about his morning, and put on a pot of coffee, not for herself, but because the sound of the coffee maker was part of his Saturday morning, and she knew that. She knew that the sound mattered. The plan we made was real. It redistributed some of the burden. But the fundamental asymmetry hadn't changed. Joy still lived 20 minutes away, and I still lived 900 miles out. A shared document and a pharmacy app don't replace a body in the room. We both knew that. We didn't say it. What had changed was smaller than I wanted it to be and larger than I deserved. I had stopped pretending that writing a check was the same as showing up. And Joy had let me see the work, not because she believed I'd match it, but because having someone else hold even a small part of it meant she could set that small part down. Sunday, the airport. I sat at the gate and called Joy to confirm the pharmacy app was working on my phone. A small technical call. The kind of call I was good at. It's set up, I said. I'll get the notifications directly. If there's a prior auth issue, I'll handle it. You shouldn't have to call them anymore. There was a pause. Then Joy said, Okay, that helps. 3 words. Not warmth, not forgiveness. Functional acceptance. The smallest possible beginning of something I couldn't yet name. I thought about the porch light. It was on when I arrived 5 days ago. It would be on tonight after I'd gone. Not for me. Not for visitors. For Dad. Part of a routine I hadn't known existed, maintained by the sister I'd been ready to blame for letting things fall apart. I'd come home to prove my sister was failing. I'd found instead that she'd been holding together a life I was too far away to see and too certain to question. The money I sent was real. The distance I kept was also real. And the judgment I carried, the quiet, efficient conviction that I would have done better, was the most expensive thing I'd been spending, because it cost me the truth. I don't know what the next months will look like. I know the pharmacy app works. I know the cereal goes above the stove. I know my father likes the blue mug. These are small things. They're the things Joy learned by being there, and they're the things I'm learning by finally admitting I wasn't. Joy didn't forgive me. She didn't need to, and I hadn't fully asked her to. What she did was hand me a corner of something heavy and let me carry it. Not because she trusted me, but because she was tired and partial help was better than none. That's where we are. It's not enough. It's a start. I wonder, have you ever been so certain someone else was falling short that you never checked whether you were the one standing still? What did it take for you to see it? This episode is an original fictional dramatization.